clutched a worn carpet bag. Her bonnet was pale blue once, but the journey had dulled its color to the shade of ash and distance. Hannah Campbell blinked against the brightness, her eyes sweeping across the barren plains until they caught the crooked sign above the station, Silvidge, Colorado. The world around her seemed to breathe in slow, heavy sighs. A town of unpainted boards, hollow winds, and restless horses tied to posts. Everything smelled of iron and dust, like a place that hadn't yet decided if it belonged to the living or the forgotten. Her heart beat harder with every step, a mix of hope and fear churning in her chest. She had come 3,000 miles across a continent to begin a new life. Yet, as her boots touched the splintered platform, the strange stillness whispered that something had gone terribly wrong. Hannah's gaze found the station master, a wiry man with grey whiskers and eyes that looked as if they'd seen too much of life's sorrows. She tried to speak, but her voice cracked like the wood beneath her feet. "I'm looking for Mr. James Blackwell," she managed. "He was expecting me yesterday." The man's eyes widened, his fingers hesitating on the brim of his hat before removing it with slow, deliberate respect. "Miss," he said softly, "Mr. Blackwell won't be expecting anyone no more. He was killed 2 days ago. A dispute over water rights. Shot dead at the Golden Spur." The words struck her like a bullet to the heart. For a long moment, Hannah couldn't breathe. The air turned thick, and the station blurred as though God himself had turned the page of her life too quickly for her to follow. James Blackwell, the stranger she'd promised to marry through letters, was gone. The man who'd written of open skies, cattle herds, and quiet companionship. The man who had sent her a ticket and a dream. Her knees weakened, and she sat on the wooden bench, clutching her bag as though it could anchor her to reality. Around her, the world continued in cruel indifference. The whistle of a departing train, the cry of a hungry dog, the rattle of wind against the station windows. Somewhere, a saloon piano played a tune that didn't belong to this moment, and Hannah's heart broke quietly beneath it. All that remained of Boston was memory, her parents buried beneath grey marble, her modest job teaching letters to children now gone with her savings. She had sold her mother's wedding brooch to buy this one chance at safety, believing she was stepping into a future of security, maybe even love. And now, nothing. Only a handful of coins, a dead fiancé, and a wilderness that didn't care who lived or died. "Ma'am, you all right there?" a voice asked gently. She looked up through her tears. A tall man stood before her, dust from the trail softening his outline. His shirt sleeves were rolled to the elbows, revealing the bronzed skin of a man who worked beneath the sun. He wasn't handsome in the delicate way of Boston men. His beauty was rough, carved by wind and labor. His blue eyes held a quiet steadiness, like the calm after thunder. Hannah tried to answer, but found no words. He removed his hat, his voice low and respectful. "Name's Colton Sullivan. I couldn't help overhearing. You were to marry James Blackwell?" She nodded, unable to trust her voice. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said simply, sincerity threading through every word. "James and I weren't close, but I knew him well enough. He didn't deserve what happened." Tears burned her eyes, though not for the man himself. She wept for the death of certainty, for the cruel joke of fate that left her stranded in a land of strangers. Colton shifted his weight, uncertain. "My sister runs a boarding house just down the street. It's safe there, clean too. You'll have a roof and a meal till you decide your next step." Hannah hesitated. The West was full of stories, some true, most cruel, about women who trusted too easily. But when she looked at him again, she saw no hunger, no deceit, only compassion worn honestly, like the dust on his boots. "Thank you," she whispered. They walked through the small town together, the sky a muted canvas of gold and rose. Silvage was still half-born, half hope, half ruin. There were women in proper dresses, chatting outside the mercantile, and others with painted faces lingering in saloon doorways. Men tipped their hats or stared too long. Every step drew whispers, a reminder that a woman alone was an open question in a place with too many answers. At the boarding house, Colton introduced her to his sister Sarah, a woman with kind eyes and the strength of someone who'd survived grief. Sarah listened to Hannah's story without pity, only understanding, and offered her a small room for half the price. "You can stay as long as you need," she said. "No woman should face the world empty-handed." That night, Hannah sat at the communal table among strangers. A school teacher, a merchant clerk, a widow knitting through silence. The food was plain but warm, and the soft hum of conversation wrapped around her like a blanket. Across the table, Colton sat quietly, eating without fuss, occasionally glancing her way. Each time their eyes met, he looked down again, as though afraid to intrude upon her sorrow. When dinner ended, he lingered a moment near her chair. "Miss Campbell," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear, "if you ever need help, with work or finding your way, you can call on me." "I'll see you treated fair." She nodded, unable to thank him properly. There was something grounding in his presence, something steady and unspoken that made the emptiness of her loss feel a little less consuming. That night, lying awake in her narrow bed, Hannah listened to the distant sounds of laughter from the saloon, the mournful whistle of wind across the plains. The mattress creaked as she turned, unable to still her thoughts. She had come west to be a wife. Now she was neither wife nor teacher, neither east nor west, only a woman adrift in God's wilderness, waiting for a sign of what to do next. But even in her grief, a flicker of warmth remained, a memory of Colton's calm eyes beneath the brim of his hat. The way his voice had carried something solid, like oak roots holding firm in a storm. She hadn't realized until that moment how deeply she needed that kind of steadiness, not to be rescued, but to be seen as someone worth saving. Outside, thunder grumbled across the plains, rolling low and slow like a warning from heaven. Hannah rose from the bed and moved to the window. The clouds were a restless sea of grey, flashing with distant light. For a long time she watched the storm move closer, the rain beginning to patter against the glass, soft at first, then insistent. Somewhere in that sound was comfort, the rhythm of cleansing, of something greater than grief washing the earth clean. Hannah pressed her forehead against the cool glass and closed her eyes. For the first time since stepping off the train, she let herself believe that her story might not be over. Perhaps what felt like ruin was merely the turning of a chapter she hadn't yet read. Far away, a lantern flickered in a distant window. Colton's room, she guessed. The sight was strangely soothing, like a star refusing to be swallowed by the night. She breathed deeply, her tears drying against her skin, her heart slowly finding rhythm again. The rain outside became a lullaby, whispering of healing and unseen beginnings. And as sleep finally drew her under, she dreamed, not of Boston's marble streets or the face of the man she was meant to marry, but of open skies, the scent of rain on wild grass, and the quiet strength in a stranger's voice. Sometimes the greatest miracles begin not with love fulfilled, but with love delayed. The next morning, the sun would rise over Silvage, painting gold across the dust, and Hannah Campbell would take her first breath of a new life, one that hadn't been promised, but was waiting just the same. If this story touched something gentle inside your heart, I'd love for you to linger a little longer with it. Share your thoughts, leave a kind word in the comments, or subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Your presence here is more than a number. It's part of the warmth that keeps stories like this alive. May this tale remind you that even when you arrive a day too late, grace might still be waiting, right on time. The morning air smelled of dust and coffee, soft with the lingering hush that comes after a night of rain. The streets of Silvage glistened with puddles that mirrored the pale sky, and Hannah stood by the window of her small room, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. The world outside was quiet, except for the rhythmic creak of wagon wheels and the faint laughter of men heading to work. She pressed her hand against the cool glass and breathed deeply, as if trying to draw courage from the light itself. A gentle knock came at her door. When she opened it, Sarah stood there with a kind smile and a plate of warm bread. "You should eat something," she said softly. "The day's kinder when you begin it with food." Hannah nodded, her gratitude unspoken but deep. There was a tenderness in Sarah's presence that reminded her of her late mother, the same firm kindness, the same belief that no soul was ever truly lost, only waiting to be found again. At breakfast, the boarding house felt alive. Sunlight spilled across the long table, gleaming off tin cups and polished spoons. The smell of bacon filled the air, mingling with the chatter of guests preparing for their day. Hannah sat quietly, listening to the hum of life around her, trying to find her place in it. Her gaze drifted toward the door just as Colton Sullivan stepped inside, brushing the trail dust from his coat. He nodded politely to the others, his hat in his hands, and for a moment his eyes met hers. Something subtle passed between them. Unspoken recognition, the kind that doesn't need words to be understood. He didn't smile, but the warmth in his gaze lingered like sunlight breaking through clouds. After breakfast, Sarah asked Hannah to help with the washing. Together they carried linens to the backyard, where the air was fragrant with wet earth and lilacs just beginning to bloom. As they worked, Sarah spoke gently of the town, of its people and their tangled stories, the widows who ran the bakery, the school teacher who loved a sheriff too proud to speak his heart, the preacher who'd come west to flee his own sins. The stories unfolded like fabric in the breeze, ordinary lives stitched together with quiet hope. Listening, Hannah felt something ease within her. Pain still lived in her chest, but it was softer now, no longer sharp enough to cut. Grief, she realized, didn't always scream. Sometimes it whispered and waited to be understood. By noon, Colton returned. He carried a small parcel under one arm and greeted Sarah before glancing toward Hannah. "I brought supplies from the mercantile," he said, his voice carrying a calm steadiness that wrapped around her like warmth from a hearth. "And a letter for Miss Campbell." It came on the morning coach. Hannah blinked in surprise. No one from Boston would have written to her. There was no one left. She took the envelope carefully, her fingers trembling. Inside was a short note from the matrimonial agency expressing condolences for Mr. Blackwell's death and offering future assistance should she desire to correspond again. The words stung like salt on a wound, as if love could be ordered and replaced by simple transaction. She folded the letter quietly and slipped it into her pocket, unwilling to let anyone see the flicker of shame that passed through her. Colton seemed to sense it without needing to ask. "You don't have to leave right away," he said gently. "The trains run often enough. Maybe give yourself time to think where you want to go next." "I don't have anywhere to go," she admitted softly. "Boston isn't home anymore." He studied her, not with pity but understanding. Then maybe this place could be for a while. The afternoon stretched into gold. The town bustled under the sun's returning warmth, and Hannah walked quietly through its narrow streets, trying to memorize every sound: the creak of signboards, the distant laughter of children chasing a stray chicken, the whistle of wind threading through the empty spaces between buildings. She stopped at the church, its bell silent, its white paint peeling. A sense of peace rested there, fragile, yet enduring. She sat on the steps for a while, closing her eyes and letting the stillness wash over her. When she opened them again, Colton was across the street, loading feed onto his wagon. He looked up, saw her watching, and offered a small nod. She hesitated, then crossed the street. "You're leaving town?" she asked. "Heading back to my ranch," he said. "Just came in for supplies." He paused, adjusting the rope around the sacks. "If you don't mind my saying, you look less lost today." She smiled faintly. "Maybe I'm just too tired to be afraid." "That's when courage starts," he said simply. His words settled deep, like seeds taking root in soil still damp from rain. She wanted to ask about his ranch, what it was like, if the land was beautiful, if it ever felt lonely, but the questions tangled on her tongue. Before she could speak, he climbed onto the wagon, tipped his hat, and drove away, the sound of hooves fading into the distance. That evening, Silvage glowed with lamplight. The sky melted into indigo, and stars flickered awake one by one. Hannah sat by the window, watching the town settle into its nocturnal hush. Below her, Sarah hummed softly while cleaning up from supper. There was comfort in that sound, the gentle rhythm of a life steady enough to build dreams upon. But Hannah's thoughts were far beyond the boarding house. They followed the trail that wound into the open land, the same path Colton had taken when he left. She imagined his silhouette against the sunset, the quiet strength of his posture, the way his hands rested with ease on the reins. Something about him lingered in her mind, not as a man who might save her, but as someone whose presence made her want to save herself. Later that night, unable to sleep, she went downstairs for water. The parlor lamp still burned low, casting soft amber across the wooden floor. There, beside the door, she noticed something she hadn't seen earlier: her small carpet bag, now mended along the torn seam that had ripped during her journey. A neat stitch ran through the fabric, strong and careful. Sarah's work, perhaps. But there was a note tucked beneath it. It was a single folded paper, the handwriting rough but clear. "Miss Campbell, the train west doesn't come easy, and I know your journey's been long. If you need honest work, my ranch could use an extra pair of hands. It's respectable and safe. You'd have your own room. I can't promise comfort, but I can promise fairness. Colton Sullivan." Her fingers trembled as she read it again, the edges softening in the candlelight. The simplicity of it touched her deeply. It wasn't an offer made from pity, but from principle. He was giving her a choice, a small bridge across the emptiness of her circumstances. She folded the note carefully and placed it beside the lamp, her heart both heavy and hopeful. Outside, the night whispered softly through the eaves. The air smelled of rain and sage. She closed her eyes and let the silence cradle her, feeling a fragile peace settle over her shoulders like a shawl. When dawn came, pale and patient, Hannah was already awake. She dressed quietly, her hands steady, her mind clear. For the first time since stepping off the train, she knew what she must do. Sarah met her in the hallway and seemed to understand without a word. "You're heading out?" she asked. Hannah nodded. "To the Sullivan Ranch." Sarah's smile was small but knowing. "He's a good man. You'll be safe there." As Hannah stepped into the morning light, the world felt new again. The streets were empty, except for a few horses and the scent of bread baking somewhere nearby. She walked toward the livery, where a wagon was already waiting. The same one Colton had driven. He stood beside it, tightening the straps, his hat low against the sun. "You got my note," he said quietly. "I did," she replied, "and I've decided to accept." He nodded once, the faintest smile tugging at his lips. "Then let's get you home." Home. The word felt strange on her tongue, yet it glowed softly in her chest, like a candle catching flame. As the wagon rolled out of Silvidge, the town shrank behind them, and the open land unfolded before her. Vast, golden, endless. Hannah watched the horizon stretch into forever, her heart pulsing in rhythm with the wheels. The wind tugged at her hair, the scent of sagebrush filling the air. Colton drove in silence, but it was a companionable silence, the kind that carried no weight of expectation. Every mile seemed to strip away the ache of loss, replacing it with something tender, something new. She glanced at him, at the steady line of his jaw, the quiet patience in his movements. He didn't look like the men she'd known in Boston, all polished and careful. He was raw and real, a man molded by land and labor. And in that authenticity, Hannah felt a strange comfort, the kind of safety that came not from walls, but from the simple truth of being beside someone who meant what he said. The trail curved around a rise, revealing a sweep of open prairie, glimmering beneath the sun. Distant mountains stood like guardians against the sky, their peaks soft with mist. The sight stole her breath. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Colton glanced at her and nodded. "It grows on you." And for a moment she believed it. Believed that even in a place shaped by hardship and loss, beauty could still take root. She felt it in the warmth of the sun on her skin, in the scent of earth after rain, in the quiet rhythm of their shared silence. Healing didn't always arrive with ceremony. Sometimes it came quietly, riding beside you on an open road. The wagon rolled on, the horizon opening wider with every turn of the wheels, and somewhere deep inside, Hannah felt the first real flutter of belonging. It wasn't the life she had planned. It was something softer, wilder, and infinitely more alive. And as the wind whispered through the tall grass, she realized that sometimes God's mercy didn't come in the form of miracles. It came as a stranger's kindness, a note left under a lamp, and a road that led exactly where her heart needed to go. The trail stretched ahead, a golden ribbon across the high plains, glowing softly beneath the late morning sun. The wheels of the wagon hummed a steady rhythm over the packed earth, a lullaby of distance and new beginnings. Hannah sat beside Colton, her hands folded tightly in her lap, the hem of her dress gathering dust, her bonnet tilted low against the wind. She hadn't spoken much since they left town, but the silence between them wasn't heavy. It was gentle, like the quiet of dawn before the world wakes. The air smelled of sage and sunlight. A hawk circled overhead, its cry sharp and lonely against the sky. Hannah's eyes followed it until it vanished over the ridge, her heart aching with a strange, tender recognition. She, too, was circling something she couldn't yet name. Hope, perhaps, or the fragile possibility of belonging. After an hour of riding, Colton finally spoke. "You can see it from here." She lifted her gaze and gasped softly. Beyond a rolling rise lay a valley brushed with gold. At its heart stood a modest ranch house, its whitewashed boards catching the light like the promise of morning. A barn and a bunkhouse flanked it, smoke curling lazily from the chimney. Fences stretched outward like careful lines drawn by steady hands. It wasn't grand, but it was alive. "Sullivan's Reach," Colton said quietly. "My mother named it." The way he spoke her name carried reverence, a small thread of grief woven through pride. Hannah glanced at him, her chest tightening at the softness in his voice. There was history here, unspoken yet felt, like the ghost of a song still echoing in the wind. As the wagon descended into the valley, the scent of earth deepened. The ranch came into full view, sturdy and weathered, surrounded by fields where cattle grazed lazily under the sun. A dog barked once from the porch, then wagged its tail, bounding toward them as they arrived. Colton smiled faintly. "That's Scout. He'll bark at you till he remembers you're a friend." Hannah stepped down carefully, her boots touching the ground of this new world. She looked around in quiet wonder. The wide porch with its worn rocking chair, the corral fence, the distant sound of water trickling through a nearby creek. It was so different from the city's clamor that she almost couldn't breathe. The silence here wasn't empty. It was full of life, of memory, of grace. Colton carried her trunk inside, his movements unhurried, respectful. The house smelled faintly of cedar and thyme. The furniture was simple but well crafted. A long wooden table, shelves lined with old books, a few framed daguerreotypes on the mantel. One of them showed a woman with kind eyes and the same tilt of smile Colton wore when he forgot to guard it. His mother, Hannah thought. He opened a door at the back of the house. "This was hers," he said, his tone low. "I kept it just as she left it. Thought it might suit you better than the spare room near the kitchen." The bedroom was small but bathed in light. White curtains stirred gently in the breeze, and the bed was neatly made, though dust lingered on the windowsill. Hannah set her gloves on the bureau and turned slowly, taking it all in. "It's lovely," she murmured. Colton smiled, his gaze steady but warm. "It'll be yours for as long as you need it." That afternoon, while he tended to the cattle, Hannah began to clean. The rhythm of sweeping, dusting and scrubbing steadied her nerves. She opened the windows wide, letting sunlight pour in, chasing away the stale scent of absence. Each small act, folding linens, wiping glass, setting flowers from the yard into a chipped vase, felt like an offering, a way to claim her place without words. By the time Colton returned, sweat darkened his shirt and dust clung to his boots. He paused at the doorway, surprise flickering in his eyes as he took in the brightened room. "You've worked half the day away," he said. Hannah smiled shyly. "It helped me think." He nodded, understanding more than she said. After supper, they sat on the porch with mugs of coffee. The sun dipped low, painting the sky in bands of rose and amber. The air cooled, and the first stars began to appear. For a long time, neither spoke. The silence between them carried the weight of peace. When Colton finally broke it, his voice was softer than the evening breeze. "My mother used to sit here every night, said this porch was her church. Out here she could see the stars and remember her place in God's plan." Hannah turned her gaze upward. The heavens spread vast and unending, infinite diamonds scattered on black silk. She felt small beneath it, but not insignificant, just part of something immense and tender. "I think she was right," she whispered. Days turned into a quiet rhythm. Hannah rose early to prepare breakfast and check the books. She learned the patterns of the ranch, the calls of the men, the songs of the windmill turning, the way the light shifted from morning gold to evening lavender. Colton treated her with unspoken respect, always keeping his distance, yet never distant. When he returned from the fields, he thanked her for meals with simple sincerity. His gratitude wasn't polite, it was genuine, and it warmed her more than she expected. In the evenings, Hannah would sit by the window with a lamp, sewing or reading from one of Colton's old books. Sometimes she heard him outside, whistling softly to the horses or talking to Scout in low tones. There was something deeply comforting in that sound, a melody of steadiness and care. One evening, a windstorm swept across the valley. The air turned wild, and the house trembled as if the earth itself were shifting. Hannah rushed to close the shutters, but one flew open, the wind tearing through with fierce force. Before she could latch it, Colton appeared beside her, his hands firm on the frame. Together they pulled it shut, the storm roaring like a living beast around them. When it was done, she turned to find herself only inches away from him, her hair loose, her breath shallow. His eyes met hers, blue, steady, full of something unspoken. Neither moved. For that brief heartbeat, the chaos outside fell away. There was only the warmth between them, the sound of shared breathing, and the pulse of something beginning. Colton stepped back first, clearing his throat. "You all right?" "Yes," she said softly, though her heart raced. "Thank you." He nodded and turned to check the rest of the windows, his movements brisk, careful, as if afraid of what silence might reveal. When he left the room, Hannah sank into a chair, pressing her hands to her chest. The storm outside had passed, but another had begun quietly within her. Over the next few days, that awareness grew. Every small kindness, his steady voice when he greeted her in the morning, the way he left extra wood by her door before cold nights, became threads in something delicate yet strong. Hannah didn't name it. She didn't dare. She had learned long ago that names gave power, and power made you vulnerable. Still, she couldn't ignore the warmth blooming in her chest whenever he smiled. One Sunday afternoon, Colton invited her to ride out to the far pasture. "The land's different out there," he said. "Quieter, somehow." He saddled a gentle mare named Belle for her and adjusted the stirrups with care. When she mounted, unsteady at first, his hands were there. firm but respectful. They rode side by side across the plains, the world stretching endlessly around them. The sky was impossibly blue, the air sweet with the scent of wildflowers. Hannah had never known such vastness, such unbroken freedom. The rhythm of the horse beneath her, the soft creak of leather, the steady presence of Colton beside her, it all felt healing, like her soul was being unwound from grief. They stopped at a small rise overlooking the entire valley. The ranch lay below, golden under the afternoon light. Hannah caught her breath. "It's beautiful," she said, her voice trembling with awe. Colton dismounted and helped her down. "It took years to make it look like this," he said quietly. "But every day I wake up and still can't quite believe it's mine." She turned to him, seeing the truth in his eyes, a man who had fought the land, not for power, but for peace. "You've built something good," she said. "Something that lasts." He smiled faintly. "Maybe. But some things only last when they're shared." His words lingered in the air, tender and uncertain. Hannah looked away, her heart fluttering like the wings of a trapped bird. The wind moved gently through her hair, carrying the scent of sage and rain. For a moment, time stilled, the world holding its breath around them. On the ride back, neither spoke, but the silence was no longer empty. It was full of possibility, of unspoken yearning, of something quietly growing between them. When they reached the house, the sun was setting, casting everything in shades of amber and rose. Hannah dismounted slowly, her body aching, but her heart light. That night, as she washed her hands in the basin, she caught her reflection in the small mirror above the dresser. The woman looking back was changed. There was color in her cheeks again, softness in her eyes. Not the frightened widow-to-be who had stepped off the train, but someone being reborn, slowly, gently, in the warmth of kindness. Outside, she could hear Colton moving about, the faint notes of a tune hummed under his breath. The sound wrapped around her like a blanket. She lay in bed, the lamp flickering low, and let herself imagine what it would feel like to stay. Not as a guest or a worker, but as part of this place, of this life. The thought scared her, but it also soothed something deep inside. Healing, she realized, wasn't a sudden light from heaven. It was a slow unfolding, the moment you began to believe that love might find you even in the quiet corners of loss. As the night deepened, she closed her eyes, her last thought drifting toward the man sleeping just beyond the wall. Somewhere between gratitude and longing, her heart whispered a prayer it didn't yet have words for. And outside, beneath the vast Colorado sky, the wind carried her unspoken hope across the sleeping land, a promise that what began as survival was slowly, tenderly becoming the start of something far greater. The morning broke in soft gold, spilling warmth across the kitchen walls and painting the floorboards in long, honeyed light. Hannah stirred a pot of coffee on the stove, the rich aroma curling into the air, mingling with the faint scent of wood smoke and soap. The house felt alive again, no longer a lonely shell filled with echoes, but a home that breathed quietly between the spaces of her footsteps. She could hear Colton outside, his low whistle blending with the rhythmic creak of the barn door. The steady sound of his presence soothed her in ways she couldn't yet name. She moved through her morning tasks with a lightness that surprised her. The sunlight caught in her hair as she swept the floor, and when she opened the windows, the prairie breeze rolled in, gentle and cool, carrying the scent of sage and the far-off song of meadowlarks. Every sound, every breath felt like renewal. There was a peace here, fragile perhaps, but real, a healing calm that had begun to mend the weary parts of her spirit. When Colton came in for breakfast, dust clung to his sleeves, and his hair was still damp from washing at the pump. He looked at her and smiled in that quiet way he had, as though the simple act of seeing her brought him ease. "Smells good," he said, sitting at the table while she set out the food. "It's only eggs and biscuits," she replied, trying not to meet his eyes for too long. "It smells like home," he said softly, and the words lingered in the air, tender and dangerous. They ate in comfortable silence. The clatter of cutlery, the soft hiss of the fire, the sigh of wind through the open window, each sound folded into the rhythm of something that felt both ordinary and sacred. When Hannah poured him a second cup of coffee, their hands brushed just for a moment, and the warmth that passed between them felt deeper than touch. After breakfast, Colton left for the fields, and Hannah found herself standing at the door, watching him go. He walked with the steady gait of a man who belonged to the land, whose soul was rooted in the same soil his boots touched. She admired that quiet strength, the way he carried his burdens without bitterness, the way he looked at the world not as something to be conquered, but to be tended. The days began to fall into a rhythm, both simple and strange. Hannah tended to the books, mended clothes, and planted a small garden behind the house. In the evenings, when Colton returned, he'd leave his gloves by the door, wash his hands, and join her for supper. Sometimes they talked about small things, the weather, the cattle, the stubborn horse that wouldn't stay penned. Other times they simply sat together in silence, listening to the crickets and the faraway howl of coyotes. The silence wasn't emptiness anymore. It was peace. It was the quiet after prayer, the hush that follows a blessing. One evening, Colton came home earlier than usual, a shy light in his eyes. "It's too fine a day to waste indoors," he said, standing by the porch with 2 horses saddled. "I thought you might like to see more of the land before the sun sets." Hannah hesitated, glancing at the horizon where the light softened into rose and amber. "I've only ridden a few times," she admitted, smoothing her skirt. He smiled, that rare, easy smile that changed his whole face. "Then we'll take it slow." The mare he brought for her was gentle, her coat the color of wheat, her eyes soft as twilight. Hannah mounted carefully, her fingers tightening on the reins. Colton rode beside her, matching her pace. The air smelled of grass and dust, and the sky stretched endlessly overhead, vast and forgiving. They rode past the creek, where the water shimmered like glass, and into a field where wildflowers nodded in the breeze. The land unfurled before them, rolling hills, soft light, the quiet majesty of open space. Every breath felt like grace. Colton pointed toward a distant ridge. "Oh, my father used to say the sky feels closer up there." "Did he love this place too?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "In his way. He loved the work, not the stillness. My mother was the one who loved the peace of it. The sound of rain on the roof, the smell of sage after a storm. I think she'd have liked you." The words sank deep, tender, and unexpected. Hannah looked away, her throat tightening. "That's kind of you to say." "It's the truth." His voice was soft but sure. They reached the ridge just as the sun dipped low, spilling molten light across the plains. The air shimmered with quiet wonder. Colton dismounted and helped her down, his hand steady on her waist. For a moment their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them, something too delicate for words, too powerful for denial. "It's beautiful," Hannah whispered. He nodded, looking out over the land. "It's what keeps me here, even when things get hard." You can lose everything else, money, sleep, certainty, but the land stays. It waits. It forgives. Hannah followed his gaze. The land stretched in every direction, endless and alive. The colors deepened into crimson and violet, the first stars trembling into view. She thought of all she had lost, of how she had come west searching for stability, and instead found this fragile, untamed beauty. Perhaps that was what love was, not safety, but surrender. They stood side by side as twilight gathered, the wind tugging softly at their clothes. The moment held a quiet holiness, the kind that doesn't need prayers to be sacred. On the way back, the world seemed gentler. Fireflies blinked among the grass, and the scent of clover hung in the air. When they reached the ranch, Colton helped her down again, his hands lingering just a heartbeat longer this time. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what?" "For reminding me what peace feels like." His eyes softened. "It suits you." That night, Hannah couldn't sleep. She lay awake listening to the night sounds, the chirp of crickets, the soft groan of the windmill turning. The air was warm, carrying the faint scent of hay and rain. Her heart ached with something she didn't fully understand. It wasn't the sharp pain of grief anymore. It was gentler, like the ache of growth, of something healing where it had once been broken. She rose and moved to the window, gazing out across the moonlit fields. The ranch was bathed in silver light, and from the barn she saw a lantern glow faintly. Colton was still awake, likely checking on the horses before turning in. The sight of him moving through the light, steady, unhurried, made something inside her melt. She pressed her hand to the glass, whispering a quiet thought that was half prayer, half confession. "Thank you for this grace." The following days carried the softness of early summer. The garden flourished under her care, green shoots pushing through soil like tiny promises. Colton built her a small table near the window so she could keep the books in proper order, and she surprised him with warm bread and apple preserves when he came home late. It was the language they spoke best, small acts of care, wordless and true. One afternoon, while hanging laundry to dry, she saw him in the distance, riding back from the far pasture. His figure against the sky looked both solitary and eternal, as if he had been born of the very dust he rode upon. When he saw her watching, he lifted a hand in greeting, and something in her chest fluttered. She waved back, smiling before she could stop herself. When he dismounted near the porch, she met him with a pitcher of water. He drank deeply, then handed it back to her, his fingers brushing hers. The touch was brief, accidental, yet charged with warmth that seemed to hum beneath her skin. "You shouldn't work so hard in the sun," he said gently. "I could say the same to you," she replied, and he laughed, the sound like sunlight breaking through clouds. The laughter faded into a softer silence. They stood there, close enough to feel the heat radiating between them, but neither moved. It was as though the air itself held them still, unwilling to let the moment pass. Later that evening, as they sat by the fire, the quiet between them deepened into something unspoken but known. The flames flickered against his face, casting soft light over his features. He looked at her then, really looked, and she felt her heart tremble beneath his gaze. "Miss Campbell," he said finally, his voice low, almost reverent. "I don't know what you've been through before you came here, but I hope this place gives you rest." "It already has," she whispered, "more than I thought possible." The words hung in the air, fragile and real. Outside, the wind shifted, brushing the curtains gently like the touch of unseen hands. The moment lingered, sweet, slow, infinite, before slipping quietly into the hush of night. When she went to bed, the house seemed to hum with a tender quiet. The moonlight spilled across the floor, silver and soft. Lying there, she felt her heart expand with something pure, something that no longer felt like survival, but the beginning of love. She closed her eyes and let the feeling cradle her, peaceful and deep. Beyond the walls, the prairie breathed in the language of wind and stars, and somewhere in the vastness of that night, she knew her soul had begun to heal in earnest. The next morning, when she woke to the sound of birdsong and the scent of coffee, the world felt new again. She smiled before she even opened her eyes, unaware that from the porch Colton was already watching the sunrise, his thoughts drifting quietly toward her, toward the woman who had brought light back into a house that had forgotten how to glow. The sky that evening was bruised with color, rose melting into violet, gold softening into blue. A quiet wind swept through the valley, carrying with it the scent of wildflowers and the far-off promise of rain. Hannah stood on the porch, watching the light fade over the land. The air was heavy, alive, as though the earth itself held its breath before a storm. Inside the house, the fire crackled softly, and a lamp glowed behind her, casting a warm halo against the glass. Colton returned from the pasture just as the first roll of thunder murmured across the plains. His shirt clung to him, damp with sweat and dust, his hat tilted low against the wind. He looked tired, but when his eyes found hers through the twilight, something in him eased, a quiet relief, as though her simple presence steadied him after the weight of the day. "You should come inside," she said softly, her voice almost swallowed by the wind. He smiled faintly, that slow, gentle smile that never asked for anything, yet gave everything. "I like it when the air smells like this," he replied. "You can feel the sky changing." She nodded, though her heart was already racing with something she didn't dare name. He climbed the steps, brushing rain from his sleeves, and stood beside her at the edge of the porch. The world around them had grown hushed, expectant. A flash of lightning split the distance, illuminating the rolling land in a brief, blinding brilliance. Hannah shivered, though it wasn't from cold. "Are you afraid of storms?" he asked, his voice softer now. "No," she said after a moment. "They remind me that there's something larger than us, something wild that we can't control, but somehow need." He looked at her with quiet wonder. "You see things in a way most folks don't." "Maybe I've learned to," she said. "When life takes everything familiar, you start looking for beauty in what's left." He didn't answer, but she felt his gaze linger, warm and steady. The rain began, soft at first, then stronger, drumming against the porch roof in a rhythm that seemed to match the pulse of her heart. They stood side by side, silent, letting the storm wash over the world. When the thunder grew louder, Hannah turned to go inside, but a sudden gust of wind swept across the porch, pulling her shawl from her shoulders. Colton caught it just before it blew away, his fingers brushing her arm as he returned it. The contact was brief, accidental, yet it sent a tremor through her, small but undeniable. Their eyes met. For a heartbeat, time seemed to still. The sound of rain faded, the lightning paused in the distance, and in the dim light between them, something fragile and sacred stirred awake. "Miss Campbell," he said quietly, his voice rough with hesitation. "Hannah." Her name on his tongue felt like a prayer spoken after years of silence. "Yes?" she whispered. He hesitated, searching for words that refused to come easily. "I've been thinking, these past months, since you arrived. I don't rightly know how I managed before. The house feels different now. Alive." Her breath caught. "It's only cleaner, that's all." He smiled faintly, shaking his head. "It's more than that. You've brought light where there was none." She looked away, blinking back the heat that rose behind her eyes. The storm thundered again, closer this time, but neither moved. "I didn't mean to intrude on your life," she said softly. "You gave me work when I had nothing to offer." "You offered more than you know," he said, his voice deepening. "Kindness. Peace. You filled the empty spaces I didn't realize were hollow." Lightning flashed again, painting his face in silver and shadow. She saw the honesty there, the quiet yearning he'd hidden so carefully behind his calm. The truth of it unraveled something in her, loosening the fear she had held tight since the day she arrived. "Colton," she said, his name trembling on her lips like a secret released into the air. He took a slow step closer, his gaze never leaving hers. "I don't want to make you uncomfortable," he murmured. "You deserve to choose your path. But if you'd let me, I'd like to walk part of it with you." Her heart fluttered like a trapped bird. For so long, she had believed love was something arranged, something earned through duty or necessity. But standing there, beneath a sky that trembled with thunder, she realized it could also be something that simply happened, quietly, inevitably, like the rain. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. He smiled, gentle and sure. "Then don't. Just stay." The rain poured harder, thick curtains of silver cascading from the roof. Without thinking, they stepped down into it, laughing as the cold drops soaked through their clothes. The world blurred into motion and sound, the smell of wet earth, the taste of water on her lips, the warmth of his hand finding hers. They ran for the barn, breathless and laughing, pushing the door open just as the wind howled behind them. Inside, the scent of hay and horses filled the air, rich and sweet. Hannah leaned against a wooden post, her chest rising and falling, strands of hair plastered to her face. Colton stood a few feet away, dripping, his hat in his hands, his smile slow and disbelieving. "I can't remember the last time I laughed like that," she said softly. "Maybe that's what you were meant to find out here," he replied, his voice low. "That life still holds joy, even after loss." Her gaze softened. "And what about you, Colton Sullivan? What did you find?" He hesitated, then stepped closer, his hand lifting to gently brush a strand of wet hair from her face. His fingers lingered near her cheek, trembling slightly. "Hope," he said. "I thought I'd buried it with the past, but somehow it's standing right here." Her breath hitched. The distance between them dissolved. His hand cupped her face, tentative but sure, and she closed her eyes as his thumb traced the edge of her jaw. The moment stretched long, suspended between thunder and heartbeat, between fear and surrender. When his lips touched hers, it wasn't fire, it was rain, soft, pure, necessary. It was the taste of homecoming, of two broken hearts finding a rhythm that finally made sense. The kiss deepened, slow and reverent, and the sound of the storm outside became a song, a backdrop to the quiet miracle unfolding in the shelter of the barn. When they finally pulled apart, Hannah rested her forehead against his chest, her breath unsteady. "This feels like something I shouldn't be allowed to have," she whispered. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her close. "Maybe it's something you were always meant to find," he said. "You just had to take the long road to get here." The rain softened, fading to a gentle patter against the roof. They stood there, wrapped in each other, and the sweet silence that follows confession. Hannah closed her eyes, listening to the steady rhythm of his heart beneath her ear. For the first time in years, she felt truly safe. Not because the world was kind, but because she had found someone who was. When the storm passed, the air outside was washed clean, the sky opening into a field of stars. They walked back to the house slowly, their fingers brushing, their hearts lighter. The night was cool, scented with wet grass and the faint smoke of the hearth. Inside, she stoked the fire while he hung his hat to dry. Neither spoke. Words seemed too small for what had changed between them. When she turned to face him, her eyes caught the soft glow of the flames reflected in his. "Will it always be this hard?" she asked quietly. "To trust that the good things can last?" He stepped closer, his voice steady. "Not hard, just brave. Love isn't about never falling. It's about standing together when you do." She smiled, her heart full and aching all at once. "Then I suppose I'll have to learn how to be brave." "You already are," he said. "More than anyone I've ever known." The room seemed to hold its breath around them. She felt the warmth of the fire, the hum of the world outside, the calm after the storm. And in that stillness she knew something unshakable had begun, not born of desperation, but of grace. Later, when she lay in bed, the sound of rain dripping from the eaves lulled her toward sleep. Her lips still tingled where his had touched hers, and her heart pulsed with quiet wonder. She thought of how her journey had begun, in grief, in loss, and how, somehow, it had led her here, to this moment of peace. Outside, the stars blinked softly through the clearing sky, and the land glowed faintly in the moonlight. Somewhere in the next room, Colton stirred, and even in the silence between their walls, she could feel his presence, a steady warmth that reached her like prayer. Hannah smiled into the darkness, a tear slipping down her cheek, not from sorrow, but from the strange sweetness of gratitude, for the storm that had broken the drought in her soul, for the man who had offered her shelter, not out of pity, but out of quiet faith. And as the night deepened, she whispered to the stillness, her voice a breath of hope carried by the wind. "Thank you for letting me arrive late, and still be right on time. The dawn that followed rose soft and golden, and though she didn't yet know what waited in the days ahead, she felt the truth of something beautiful taking root. Love, fragile and fierce, growing in the soil of second chances. The storm had passed, but its rain had left the world new, and so too her heart tender and blooming beneath the morning sun. Autumn came quietly to the valley, brushing the grasslands in hues of gold and copper. The air grew cooler, carrying with it the scent of ripening fields and wood smoke, and each dawn rose wrapped in soft mist that kissed the windows before fading into sunlight. Life at the ranch settled into a rhythm that felt almost sacred, measured by the turning of seasons, the steady heartbeat of work, and the quiet companionship that had grown between them. For Hannah, each morning began before the sun. She would rise to the pale blue light, light the stove, and listen to the first stirrings of the land outside. The birds called to one another through the chill air, and sometimes, from beyond the open window, she could hear Colton whistling low to the horses as he saddled them. That sound always brought her peace. It was the same every day, yet never the same at all. Alive, steady, grounding. When he came in for breakfast, his boots would leave faint trails of dust across the wooden floor. He always removed his hat by the door, his hair mussed from the wind, his smile shy but warm. They had found a balance now, something tender and unspoken that lived between glances and gestures. His kindness had no urgency, and her affection no fear. It was love that didn't demand, only was. The storm that had changed everything seemed far away now, like a memory wrapped in rain. Yet sometimes when she caught him watching her while she worked, she felt that same quiet electricity hum through her veins, the way his eyes softened when she laughed, the gentle care in how he spoke her name. It all carried a reverence she hadn't known a heart could hold. As the weeks passed, their bond deepened through the simplest acts. She mended his shirts, and he built her a small bookshelf by the window for the few worn novels she had brought from Boston. When he read aloud to her in the evenings, his voice low and rough, stumbling over the formal words, she found herself falling in love not with the stories, but with the way he read them, slow and careful, as if each word deserved tenderness. Sometimes they rode out to the far pasture together, not speaking much, just sharing the same wide horizon. The world seemed to open endlessly before them, rolling fields, a creek glittering under sunlight, and mountains rising blue and solemn in the distance. Hannah found comfort in that expanse, the way it reminded her that her grief had not been the end of her story, but the beginning of something she couldn't yet see when she first stepped off that train. One evening, after supper, Colton appeared at the door holding a small bunch of wildflowers, lavender, daisies, and one stubborn rose that must have survived from the garden by the creek. "For your room," he said, placing them in her hands with a faint blush on his cheeks. She smiled, touched more deeply than she could say. "You found a rose this late in the season?" "Stubborn thing, growing where it shouldn't," he said, his gaze meeting hers. "Reminded me of someone." The warmth of his words filled her chest, soft and radiant. She arranged the flowers in a small jar, setting them on her bedside table. That night, as she lay in the soft glow of lamplight, she thought about what it meant to bloom in unlikely soil, and realized she had begun to do exactly that. The next weeks blurred in gentle motion. Colton began taking her into town on Sundays for church, where whispers followed them, curious but kind. Sarah greeted her with open arms, pleased beyond words to see her brother's eyes brighter than they'd been in years. The children of the boarding house crowded around Hannah, begging for stories of Boston, their laughter filling her heart with a joy she hadn't known since she was a teacher. It was on one of those drives back from town, the sun low and golden behind them, that Colton broke the long silence between them with a quiet confession. "Hannah," he said, his voice rougher than usual, "I've been thinking a lot lately about what it means to build something that lasts." She turned to him, her hands resting in her lap. "You've built more than most men ever will." He shook his head slightly, eyes still on the road ahead. "Land, cattle, fences, those things don't mean much if you don't have someone to share them with. My mother used to say, a home isn't built from timber or nails. It's made of the hands that hold it together." He paused, swallowing hard. "I think she'd want me to say this out loud, even if I stumble through it. I don't just want you here because it feels right. I want you here because it feels like home when you are." The wagon creaked over a dip in the trail, but Hannah barely noticed. Her breath caught in her throat, her pulse trembling like a string drawn too tight. "I know I'm not the man you came west to find," he continued, his voice low, "but I'd like to be the man you choose to stay with." The sunlight poured across the valley, gilding everything in amber. For a moment, she could hardly see him for the brightness of it. Then she reached over, her hand trembling as it brushed his. "You already are," she whispered. He turned, meeting her gaze, and in that moment something unspoken between them became certain. The love that had grown in silence now stood strong enough to be named. When they reached the ranch, the air had cooled, and the scent of rain drifted once more from the mountains. They walked to the ridge above the house, the same place they had stood weeks ago. The sun slipped low, touching the horizon like a dying flame. "I used to think God forgot about me," Hannah said quietly. "When I lost everything in Boston, when I found out James was gone. But standing here with you, I think maybe he was just waiting for the right moment." Colton took her hand, his thumb brushing the back of it gently. "Maybe he just wanted you to take the long way home." She leaned into him, the warmth of his body grounding her, the steady rhythm of his heartbeat whispering peace. The wind lifted her hair, and he tucked it gently behind her ear. That night the house glowed with lamplight and quiet laughter. Sarah's visit had brought a pie, and Colton insisted on sharing it, even though it was nearly midnight. They sat at the kitchen table, crumbs and coffee between them, smiling over small things. When she laughed, truly laughed, Colton reached across the table and took her hand again, holding it without words. The world outside was silent but alive, the crickets singing, the wind whispering through the eaves. Inside, everything felt as it should be, as if the universe had finally set something right. When Hannah rose to leave for her room, he stood with her. At the doorway, she turned, hesitating. "Colton," she said softly, "when you said I made this house alive again, did you mean it?" He looked at her with eyes full of light. "Every word." She stepped closer, close enough that she could feel his breath. "Then promise me something. Anything. Don't ever stop building it with me. Whatever comes." He nodded, his voice a quiet vow. "Whatever comes." And then he kissed her, slowly, reverently, as if time itself bowed to make room for it. It was a kiss that didn't ask for possession, only understanding, not a spark that burned, but a warmth that healed. The kind of love that made even silence feel like music. They didn't speak again that night, but when Hannah went to bed, her heart was full beyond measure. Outside, rain began to fall softly, tapping against the roof in a rhythm that lulled her toward sleep. She dreamt of sunlight on wildflowers, of laughter carried by wind, of hands clasped in promise beneath an endless sky. In the morning, when she woke to the scent of rain-soaked earth and the sound of Colton's voice outside calling to the horses, the world felt renewed. The valley shimmered with dew, the horizon stretching wide and open like a blessing. She stepped outside barefoot, the damp grass cool beneath her feet, and watched him from the porch. The man who had turned her sorrow into belonging, her fear into faith. He looked up and caught her watching, his smile quiet and sure. "Morning, Hannah," he called. She smiled back, her voice light as wind. "Morning, Colton." In that simple exchange, everything unspoken between them was clear. Their hearts had already found the rhythm of forever. The day rose bright and new, the air filled with the scent of cedar and wet grass, and somewhere within her a deep peace bloomed. The life she had once feared was over, had only just begun. The wind stirred the curtains, carrying with it a whisper that seemed to belong to the land itself. A reminder that love, when it finally arrives, does not always come as thunder or fire. Sometimes it comes quietly, in the soft turning of seasons, in the steady devotion of two souls who choose every day to stay. And as the morning light spilled over Sullivan's Reach, Hannah felt it settle deep in her heart. The truth that love, once found, becomes the most sacred kind of home. Winter crept in softly that year, like a tender hand placing white lace upon the world. Frost gathered along the fence posts, glimmering in the first light of dawn, and the creek beside the barn froze over in thin, glassy layers that cracked under the hooves of passing horses. The air was sharp but beautiful, so pure it almost sang. For Hannah, it was her first true winter in the West, and everything about it felt new. How the land seemed both endless and intimate under snow, how the silence carried the sound of her own heartbeat, how the firelight inside the house glowed like a promise against the cold. Life with Colton had settled into something deeper than she'd ever known. There was no grand announcement, no single moment that marked their union. It had happened naturally, like rivers finding their way to the sea. And they rose together with the dawn, worked side by side through the day, and ended their evenings by the hearth, their hands often brushing without thought as they shared supper. He treated her not as someone fragile, but as an equal, and in that quiet respect she found a kind of freedom she hadn't realized she needed. The first heavy snow came late one afternoon while Colton was out in the north pasture. Hannah watched from the window as the sky thickened with grey and the wind began to sing through the valley. By nightfall the ranch was buried in white, the world hushed and still. When he finally returned, his hat and coat were powdered with snow, his face flushed from the cold. She met him at the door with a blanket and laughter that bubbled up without permission. "You look like you've wrestled a blizzard and lost," she teased. He grinned, shaking the snow from his hair. "Reckon the blizzard fought fair," he said, and she took his coat from his shoulders, her hands lingering a moment longer than needed. The heat from his skin reached her fingertips, a quiet spark that warmed her even more than the fire did. They ate supper by the hearth, watching the storm rage outside. The wind howled around the corners of the house, but within those walls there was peace, a small circle of light and warmth carved out from the wilderness. After the dishes were done, Colton added another log to the fire and sat beside her. She had taken to knitting in the evenings, her movements steady and graceful. He watched her in silence for a while before speaking, his voice low. "You make this place feel like it's been waiting for you all along." She smiled without looking up. "It was waiting for someone willing to see its beauty," she said softly. "You built it with your hands, but you kept its heart open." He turned his gaze toward the flames, the light flickering in his eyes. "And you filled that heart, Hannah." The words hung in the air between them, fragile as the snow falling outside. She set her knitting aside, her breath trembling. "Colton," she began, but he shook his head gently. "I'm not asking for an answer tonight," he said. "Just wanted you to know what's true for me." Her chest ached with tenderness. There was something sacred in his honesty, a kind of love that asked for nothing but to be shared. The fire popped, sending tiny sparks upward like blessings, and in their glow she reached out, her fingers brushing his. He turned his hand, entwining his fingers with hers, and the silence that followed felt like the purest prayer she had ever known. Days passed, soft and slow as falling snow. The ranch seemed wrapped in stillness, time moving only through the rhythm of simple things, feeding the animals, mending clothes, baking bread. Yet beneath that simplicity ran a current of quiet joy. Each glance between them spoke what words could not. Each shared task became a dance of understanding. One morning, as Hannah stood near the barn scattering grain for the chickens, Colton came up behind her, his breath warm against the chill air. "You're braver than most men I know," he murmured. She laughed, turning to face him. "Because I feed chickens. Because you came here with nothing and turned it into everything." His eyes searched hers, steady and kind. "You taught me that peace isn't what we find, it's what we make." Her throat tightened. "And you taught me that love doesn't have to arrive perfect to be real." He brushed a strand of hair from her cheek, his touch gentle as the falling snow. "Then we've both learned something worth keeping." Their laughter mingled with the sound of wind chimes that hung by the porch, their gentle notes carrying across the cold air like fragments of a song too lovely to fade. As winter deepened, they began preparing for Christmas. Hannah decorated the mantel with pine branches and ribbons Sarah had sent from town. Colton carved a wooden ornament in the shape of a heart, rough but full of care, and hung it above the hearth. On Christmas Eve they shared supper alone, the fire crackling, the snow glittering beyond the windows like scattered starlight. Afterward, Colton opened the small box he'd kept hidden beneath his chair. Inside was a simple silver ring, polished smooth, its surface glinting like moonlight. He held it out to her, his hand trembling slightly. "I wanted to wait until spring," he said quietly, "but waiting feels foolish when I already know what I want. I love you, Hannah. Not as a passing season, but as the rest of my life." Her breath caught. The firelight danced across his face, and in his eyes she saw not a promise of grand gestures, but the kind of love that endures storms and silence alike. She reached for the ring, her fingers trembling, tears blurring her vision. "I love you too," she whispered. "With everything I am." He slid the ring onto her finger, and in that small, shining moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The storm outside softened to a whisper, and the wind, which had howled all night, grew still. The peace that filled the room felt alive, almost holy. They married 2 days later in the little church in town. Sarah stood beside her, weeping openly, while Miguel and his son from the ranch served as witnesses. The town gathered not from obligation, but curiosity. A mail-order bride whose story had begun in sorrow, now finding her ending in love. When the preacher spoke the final words, Colton took Hannah's hands and kissed them gently, his eyes glistening. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," the preacher said with a knowing smile. Afterward, as they rode home through the snow, Hannah leaned her head against Colton's shoulder. "Do you ever think about how unlikely all of this was?" she murmured. "Every day," he replied. "You were meant to meet another man, and yet you found your way to me." She smiled softly. "Maybe we both arrived exactly when we were supposed to." The ranch welcomed them home with quiet joy. Smoke curled from the chimney, the horses snorted in greeting, and Scout bounded through the snow with uncontainable excitement. Inside, the house glowed with warmth, the air thick with the scent of pine and baking bread. As Colton carried her across the threshold, his laughter low and full, Hannah realized that the home she'd once feared she'd never find had been waiting here all along. That night they sat by the fire, wrapped in a blanket, the silence between them filled with gentle contentment. Outside, the moon cast a silver glow over the frozen land, and the wind whispered softly through the pines. Colton rested his hand over hers, his thumb brushing the silver ring that gleamed faintly in the firelight. "You know," he said, his voice quiet and full of wonder, "when I first saw you standing on that train platform, I thought you looked lost. But now I see you were just on your way home." Her eyes glistened as she leaned closer, her voice trembling with tenderness. "And you were the road that led me there." He smiled, his forehead resting against hers. "Then, let's keep walking it, no matter where it takes us." The fire burned low, its last embers glowing deep and steady, and Hannah felt herself melt into the moment. The warmth of his hand, the steady beat of his heart, the sound of the snow falling softly against the windows. She realized love wasn't something that had found her all at once. It had unfolded slowly, gently, like dawn breaking over the prairie. When she closed her eyes that night, she dreamed not of the past, but of the seasons to come, their laughter echoing through the fields, children's voices under open skies, the house filled with life and stories yet to be written. Outside, the snow kept falling, blanketing the world in silence. Inside, two hearts beat in harmony, no longer searching, no longer wandering, only resting, finally, in the quiet certainty of love that heals, love that lasts, love that feels like home. And as the fire dimmed to its final glow, Hannah's last waking thought was a prayer, soft and full, that this peace, this warmth, this endless tenderness might stretch through every winter of their lives, forever. Spring came like a hymn sung softly across the valley, breathing life into every corner that winter had silenced. Snow melted into clear streams that whispered through the grasslands, and the wind carried the scent of lilacs and rain. The earth pulsed again with color, fields of green unfurling beneath a sky so blue it seemed like a blessing. On mornings like these, Hannah often stood barefoot by the porch, her hands resting gently on the curve of her belly, feeling the quiet miracle growing within her. The ranch woke each day with the rhythm of love woven into its heartbeat. Chickens clucked near the barn, the horses nickered for grain, and somewhere in the distance Colton's voice drifted on the breeze as he called to the cattle. His laughter, rare and deep, carried across the open land like sunlight. Every sound belonged to something steady and sacred. When he returned from the fields, he'd always find her waiting by the fence, her cheeks flushed from the wind, her hair tangled by the day. He'd swing down from his horse, take her hands in his, and press his forehead to hers, as though it were the only prayer that mattered. "You make this place feel like the world's been forgiven," he once whispered, and she smiled through tears, knowing she had found the kind of peace people spend lifetimes searching for. Their love was no longer a quiet miracle. It had become a living thing, woven through their work, their laughter, their moments of silence. In the evenings, when the sun set fire to the horizon, they'd sit together on the porch, his arm wrapped around her shoulders as she leaned against him, the smell of grass and dusk wrapping them in stillness. Sometimes they spoke of their plans, a new barn, a garden full of herbs and roses, but mostly they simply sat and watched the light fade, the stars rise, and the world settle into grace. Sarah visited often that spring, bringing quilts, baby clothes, and laughter that filled the house like a familiar song. She teased Colton about his protective fussing, insisting that no man alive could hover over a wife quite so much. Hannah only smiled because she saw in his care something tender, a man who had lost enough to know the worth of what remained. One night, near the end of May, a storm rolled over the mountains, dark and wild. Lightning flared across the horizon, and the wind rushed through the trees with the force of something ancient. Hannah sat near the fire, her hands folded over her growing belly, while Colton secured the shutters and checked the animals. When he returned, rain streaked his face, his hair dark and wet. He knelt beside her, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "The storm's fierce tonight," he murmured, "but it'll pass." She nodded, feeling the baby stir gently inside her, a small flutter of life that made her breath catch. "I'm not afraid anymore," she said softly. "Not of storms, not of what comes next." He smiled, his thumb tracing circles against her hand. "That's because you've found your strength." "No," she whispered, meeting his gaze. "It's because I found you." Outside, thunder rolled through the valley, but inside, the fire burned steady, filling the room with warmth. It was a night made for gratitude, the kind that hums quietly in the bones, reminding you that love is the calm that survives the wind. Weeks later, the morning she had long awaited arrived with the cry of meadowlarks and sunlight spilling across the floorboards. The birth was long, filled with both pain and beauty, but when the baby's first cry broke through the dawn, the world itself seemed to pause. Colton's hands shook as he held their daughter for the first time, his rough fingers cradling her as if she were made of starlight. "She's perfect," he whispered, his voice trembling. "You've given me everything." Hannah watched him through tears, exhaustion softening her smile. "No," she breathed. "We've built everything, together." They named her Clara, after Colton's mother, and from the moment she opened her eyes, the ranch felt changed, alive in a new way. The rhythm of life deepened, mornings filled with laughter and lullabies, evenings with the gentle hush of rocking chairs and the glow of lamplight. Colton would read aloud while Hannah nursed the baby, his voice tender, his words slow and reverent. Sometimes she'd look at him and wonder if heaven could ever feel as peaceful as this. As the months passed, the ranch flourished. The cattle thrived, the garden bloomed, and the sound of children's laughter soon joined the hum of daily work. Hannah began teaching the neighbors' children their letters at the long wooden table by the window, her voice carrying warmth and patience. Colton built her a small schoolhouse near the creek, painting it white with a blue door to match the Colorado sky, he said. It became more than a classroom. It was a place of hope, a space where knowledge and kindness grew side by side. Each season brought its gifts. In summer, wildflowers carpeted the hills, and Clara toddled through them with chubby fingers full of petals. In autumn, they gathered apples from the orchard, their baskets brimming with sweetness. In winter, they shared stories by the fire, wrapped in quilts, the world outside silent and still. And through it all, love moved between them like breath, constant, unspoken, unbreakable. Sometimes Hannah still thought about the life she'd left behind, the cobblestone streets of Boston, the quiet grief of losing everything familiar. But those memories no longer hurt. They had softened with time, turned into the kind of gentle ache that reminds you how far you've come. The pain had been her passage, the train that carried her west, late but not lost. One evening, years later, as the sun dipped low and painted the valley in shades of honey and rose, she and Colton climbed the ridge overlooking the ranch. Their daughter ran ahead, her laughter echoing through the open air. Hannah leaned into Colton's shoulder, her fingers intertwined with his. "Do you ever think about how it all began?" she asked. He smiled, gazing out over the land that had grown under their care. The barns, the fences, the schoolhouse, all standing against the backdrop of wild beauty. "Every day," he said. "You were supposed to arrive a day too late for another man, but you came right on time for me." Tears glistened in her eyes as she rested her head against him. "Maybe God always knew where I needed to be," she whispered. "He did," Colton said softly. "He just wanted to take the long way to lead you home." They stood together as the wind brushed through the tall grass, the sun setting in golden fire. Below them, the ranch glowed with life, smoke curling gently from the chimney, horses grazing in the fading light, the laughter of a child blending with the song of the wind. It was the picture of grace, of two souls who had found not perfection, but peace. As twilight deepened, Colton turned to her, his voice low and full of love. "Thank you," he said, "for everything, for believing when I didn't, for staying when it was hard, for being the light when the world went dark." Hannah smiled, her fingers brushing his cheek. "We saved each other," she said simply. And as night fell across the land, stars rising like scattered blessings, she felt that truth settle deep inside her heart. Their story wasn't one of luck, but of faith, of timing written by hands greater than their own. Love had come not as thunder or miracle, but as dawn breaking after a long night, slow and sure and full of warmth. Years later, when Clara was grown and the ranch stretched far beyond what either of them had dreamed, Hannah still woke each morning before the sun. She'd stand by the window, the air cool and bright, and watch the light spill over the hills. Colton would come up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Still up before me," he'd whisper, and she'd laugh softly, the sound full of years and tenderness. "Someone has to make sure the morning knows it's welcome," she'd reply. And outside, the land they built together would stir with life, the wind through the grass, the whinny of horses, the echo of children's voices. It was a melody of everything they had ever been, everything they had ever given, everything love had made whole. In the quiet glow of those mornings, she often thought of the girl who once stepped off a train, lost and afraid, one day too late. She wished she could tell that girl that every delay, every heartbreak, every twist of fate was leading her here, to this light, this peace, this love that asked for nothing but to be shared. Love had made her strong. Love had made her whole. And in its gentle hands she had found forever. As the final light of evening settled over the ranch and the stars began to bloom once more above the horizon, Hannah turned toward the quiet hum of life inside her home, the sound of laughter, of warmth, of everything that mattered. Her heart whispered the same prayer it always did. Thank you for letting me arrive late, but right on time. If this story touched something soft within your heart, let your light linger here a little longer. Leave a thought, a word, a memory in the comments below. If it reminded you that love can still find its way through every storm, share it with someone who might need that truth tonight. And if these words brought you a breath of peace, I invite you to stay, subscribe, follow, and walk with me through more stories of grace, of healing, of love that always arrives when the soul is ready.